Thank you for joining us for a regulatory guide to maintaining the integrity of professional education programs. My name is Joe McClary, and I am the CEO of the International Association for Continuing Education and Training. First, as we begin our presentation today, I'd like to give you the scope of who our audience is. Today, we're especially addressing regulatory officials that are employed or been appointed or elected to a regulatory position within a regulatory agency. A regulatory agency is essentially a group that is charged with protecting the public interest for a particular profession or industry. We see regulatory agencies that exist for accountants, dentists, real estate agents, appraisers, mortgage professionals, and the list goes on and on and on. The regulatory agency has four major responsibilities to society and to its state government, or I should say provincial, because we see not only the regulatory structure of a regulatory agency being prevalent throughout the United States, but also in Canada and throughout different places across the globe. So the four major facets, the four major responsibilities of a regulatory agency would include the regulation promulgation, or interpreting the statutes that a legislature has given them. Oftentimes legislatures can't get into the minutia of what it takes to regulate a particular profession. So what they do is set a high-level policy, and then that policy is interpreted and expanded upon through rulemaking, or in some cases what you may call regulation. So we see that that is one of the primary responsibilities of a regulatory agency. The next responsibility of a regulatory agency would be defining licensing requirements. What does it take to become licensed in a particular profession? Sometimes that is defined at a high level by a legislature. Other times the freedom is given to the agency to specify what type or how much education is needed for a practitioner to earn a license in a particular industry or profession. The third, and the item that we will be spending the most amount of time in this presentation, would be the regulatory agency's responsibility to define qualifying and continuing education requirements. So when you become a licensed professional, how much time in class would it take you? How much education would you need to earn a license? Also, after you receive your license, how many hours of education do you need on an annual or biannual or on a licensing cycle basis to keep your license? So essentially, the regulatory agency's job is to ensure that the professionals maintain a defensible, documentable measure of their competency to practice their profession. And again, the purpose here is to protect the public interest. A fourth requirement, a fourth component of regulatory agencies' responsibility would be the enforcement of those requirements. So, for example, if you have 10,000 licensees in a particular jurisdiction, each one of those licensees are required by law to complete so much continuing education every licensing cycle. How do you know that they actually did that? How do you know what happens to a professional when they break the rules or the regulations? Typically, they're investigated, there's a hearing, and then in some cases they may be prosecuted or their case forwarded to criminal authorities for prosecution. Or what type of prosecution do they have under the regulatory agencies for their lack of conformance with the regulatory policy? So these are the four major responsibilities of a regulatory agency, and we'll spend our remaining time discussing essentially the qualifying and continuing education requirements. When a regulator defines what these requirements are, it's important that they get those requirements right. Because if you don't get the requirements for continuing education right, essentially it could result in a professional practice that is not up to par to protect the public interest. If you have professionals who don't take education that has integrity and they don't learn a whole lot, the result can be an atmosphere of incompetence, frankly. And sometimes the regulatory agencies do a wonderful job of maintaining continuing education requirements and ensuring their integrity. Other agencies, as you would expect with almost anything, do not. So the goal of this presentation is to help regulatory authorities identify how they can ensure the integrity of their continuing education requirements and how IACET can help with that if you so choose. So let's take a look and discuss just for a moment. Once a regulatory agency defines a regulatory regimen, that education is going to have to be provided by a provider, an education provider of some type. If you're in Canada, professionals are often uniquely and solely educated by their industry associations. And the associations essentially have a lock on the education that is provided to different industries. It's not that way in the United States, however. In the United States, we see that the states don't want to hold the state association as the unique provider of education. They believe that that would create a conflict of interest and that they should not be impeding other private providers from participating and offering that education. So essentially, we see in the United States and most of the regulatory structures that education can be offered by private education providers, companies that specify or that specialize in offering education for particular industries or professionals. So when we begin to see and we can answer the questions, where can professionals get their qualifying and continuing education? And we would see that typically in the United States, especially in other parts of the world, that approved education providers sell coursework to fulfill regulatory requirements for practitioners. So if you want to get your license or your continuing education, you simply go to a proprietary school or organization and you take the coursework from that organization that's been approved by a regulatory agency, and you keep and you earn your credential to continue practicing your profession. Oftentimes, we see that continuing education is either measured in hours, CEUs, as IACET calls it, CPEs, as in other industries, continuing professional education units, or continuing professional education hours. And oftentimes that these CEUs, CPEs, or whatever you'd like to call it, are offered by an education provider approved by a regulatory agency. Oftentimes, that education can be offered in any number of different delivery methods. You could offer courses online. Some regulators still don't see the integrity, or they see the lack of accountability in long online education, or the inability to facilitate interactive learning in online courses. And we see that some regulatory agencies limit the amount of professional education that can be taken online. Other delivery methods would include the classroom, just the standard old come to class and a teacher instructs you from a podium. That is very common in industries today. Also, hybrid education is growing in leaps and bounds, and we see that that's a combination of online education and classroom-based education. Essentially, you take a portion of the course online and then come to class for the interactive components. Finally, we have other delivery methods such as paper and pencil correspondence courses. These lack integrity in the view of many regulators and thus have been outlawed in many industries. And when we say outlawed, we just mean prohibited. There's too many ways to circumvent the education in a paper and pencil-based correspondence course. What do we mean by that? Well, I'll give you an example. For example, a student receives a book in the mail and they need 3 hours of continuing education credit. They read the book, theoretically, and they flip to the back and they send in a short 10-question quiz, and then they get their 3 hours of credit. The question for the regulator typically is, well, how do you know that the student spent 3 hours in the class? How do you know that that education was appropriate for that level of professional? There was no other interaction throughout the course. The quiz could have been overly simplified, and thus we see that the regulator often distrusts paper and pencil correspondence courses. The rationales for them disliking that type of education are the list goes on and on. Some providers, some states, some provinces still allow paper and pencil-based correspondence for professional education, primarily due to political pressures from the industry or perhaps providers who have made a substantial living from offering that type of education. Nevertheless, those are some of the major delivery methods that we see professional education being offered for. Now, keep in mind this, that once we have a proprietary school, an education provider offering education for money, it creates a marketplace. So when we have a regulatory agency approving multiple providers to offer professional education, certain phenomena begin to occur. Number one, as we see here in the diagram, we have provider 1 offering 4 courses, provider 2 offering 4, provider 3 offering 4. It could be many, many more. Some providers offer 1 course. Some providers could offer hundreds of courses. It really depends. But for the sake of this example, we have the 3 here for visualization. What would happen between these providers once they're approved to offer that education is that they will begin to compete with each other for the attention of learners in the respective industries and professions. Well, competition is not inherently a bad thing. Actually, it can be very good. In a professional education regimen, it is not always a positive thing. And let me explain why. Oftentimes, when providers offer education and they compete against one another, it's in their best interest to attract as many students as they can. Which leads to the question, how do they attract students? Some may say, well, they can just provide the best education and the student will naturally flock to the provider who offers the best and highest quality education. After all, that's how other markets work. Markets typically work where the customer goes to where they can get the most product for the least amount of money. Well, in and of itself, that's true in many regards, but it's not true in regard to professional education. And here is why. Education is one of the only things people are willing to pay for and not receive. Again, education is one of the only things people are willing to pay for and not receive, and this has a profound effect on professional education. So, for example, provider 1 could eliminate quizzes and assessment and just allow the student to do a final check that they've read the material. Now, if you were a professional who were a very busy professional and you knew that you weren't going to have to take any quizzes with provider 1, but you were with providers 2 and 3 because they had high levels of accountability for learning, where would you go for your education if you didn't think that you needed it? Provider 1, where they're not going to provide any of that rigor, or would you go to provider 2 or 3? We would submit that most or many of the professional practitioners or licensees would go to provider 1. We've proven that with research in several industries. And I've been a part of those research studies that have shown, without a doubt, that professionals, as many as half of the professionals licensed in a particular industry, will migrate toward the education that has the less rigor, because the product that they're trying to purchase is not the quality education, it's the compliance. They want to ensure that they meet the government requirement. So essentially, if you have the government that's going to tell you you have to maintain competency to practice in a particular profession, and you have to take education to ensure your professionalism to practice in that industry, and you don't believe that you need any of that education, where are you going to go to take it? The answer is to the lowest cost and location that provides that compliance as fast and as cheap as possible. So we see here that there's some certain obstacles to free markets that enter into professional education circles that regulators need to be concerned with. Let's now examine three intertwined components that need to be considered by regulators when ensuring quality education regimens. So here are three major considerations. First of all, the content of a course. How do you know what's being taught is appropriate for the profession, and how is it protecting the public interest, or is it effective? So if you're a dentist and there is a course on how to effectively clean someone's teeth, how do you know that that education is correct and that it complies or is in line with standard practice in professional literature? That's the regulator's primary job, is to ensure that the content is appropriate. And frankly, it's the job that most regulatory agencies are best at: content approval. Oftentimes, regulators do make the false assumption that content is the only thing to approve in regard to a quality education course. It is not. There are two other facets that we'll discuss here. The second facet would be instructional design. So, in other words, how has the education been structured? Are there clear objectives? Are there appropriate assessments to measure those objectives or those outcomes? Are there appropriate educational activities that will teach students in different learning modalities? Is there accountability for learning? All these things need to be considered, and quality needs to be maintained to ensure that the experience is quality from the beginning until the end. The third component that's intertwined that needs to be considered for regulators in ensuring quality professional education regimens is the delivery of the course. How do you know that the instructors are qualified? Not just as subject matter experts. Usually that's not the problem. Regulatory agencies have sometimes stringent requirements for how long an instructor needs to have been practicing to be an instructor. But it's also interesting that oftentimes there are no requirements for teaching experience or ensuring that that instructor is familiar with the basic fundamental components of andragogy or adult education theory, how to teach adults, how to learn. Those are also very, very important components. We know that instructors can be wonderful professionals, but we also understand that many of them can be lousy teachers. So part of the philosophy of ensuring a quality delivery is ensuring that the instructor is is qualified not only in the subject matter but in their educational expertise. In addition, we look at the delivery facilities. Is the course or is the educational learning event being offered in a place that meets an educational standard? Again, oftentimes we see providers who excel at their profession, but then think that they can just jump into the education world and provide a quality experience, and often there's much more to be considered than meets the eye. So these are three major components that regulators need to consider when they approve their education. So let's take a look at pitfalls that involve each one of these three intertwined components. And hopefully identifying these pitfalls will help you, the regulator, to avoid them in your regulatory agency. Number one, here's some, number one, the first pitfall to ensure pitfalls to ensuring quality professional education programs and how to avoid them. First of all, agency reviewers are not practicing industry professionals. So in other words, you have a regulatory agency that hires someone to come in, they read the laws, and then they begin to evaluate education that's submitted. That may be an acceptable way for some regulatory agencies, but it's certainly not a best practice. So keep in mind that when you have reviewers, people reviewing the content of the course, they need to be qualified to do so. They need to have the experience to be able to evaluate the subtlety in course outlines and what's being taught to ensure it's to ensure its professionalism for your jurisdiction. Also, we also see regulatory agencies often getting caught into what I call a rubber stamp approval mentality. How this works is like this. The staff of a regulatory agency will do a general cursory overview of a course and its outline, and then they will make a recommendation to a larger board or a commission of practitioners, and those practitioners will then make a vote, or they will express approval in some way, and oftentimes there are not adequate time or resources for them to evaluate. So essentially, the regulatory agency gets into a habit of rubber stamping courses. I've seen this personally over and over and over in numerous regulatory agencies in numerous industries, especially prevalent in industries where we have umbrella agency staff working to approve the courses. Now, that's not any type of slight against umbrella agency regulatory agencies. I'm just saying that's where it is most prevalent when we see the rubber stamp effect happening. So just keep in mind, again, nothing against umbrella agency, regulatory agencies. For those of you who don't know what an umbrella agency is, most of you, if that rings a bell, you know what an umbrella agency is. An umbrella agency is essentially when you have one agency, one bureaucracy working for all the different professions. You have a lot of different professions under one roof. So you might have the doctors, the lawyers, you might have dental hygienists, accountants, all under one board, one bureaucracy. And so investigators who investigate real estate may also investigate dentistry. It runs the gamut. So you can see how that bureaucracy could be ineffective. So don't let that affect your professional education regimen or the quality of it. Also, we see education providers try to make content work for as many jurisdictions as possible and try to avoid content that is unique to one jurisdiction. So this goes back to the model that we showed you before, where education providers have a natural inclination to want to offer their courses to as many students or as many learners as possible. When you offer as many courses as you can, the goal then would not be necessarily provide you all the subtlety that you need in each jurisdiction, but to remove the subtlety in the content for each jurisdiction and to make the course as generic as possible. There are several providers that I have spoken with over the years, some of them, again, very large. Some of them, if I mention their name, you would know who they are. They've told me that one of their strategies is to make content as generic as possible so it fits into as many states as possible. In that type of environment, what you often will get then are courses that are not up to snuff or don't meet the rigor expectations for professional education for people who have been practicing for a long time. You get very, very basic courses where the education is, the content is correct, but it's not nearly as rigorous, nor do you understand the jurisdictional subtlety of the content and how it's appropriate for that particular jurisdiction. So keep that in mind and make sure that the education that you approve has the appropriate rigor and that it's appropriate for professionals who have been practicing for a period of time. So as far as instructional design pitfalls, often emphasis on instructional design is minimized or not considered at all. I can't tell you how many times, I would say probably at least a third of the regulatory agencies that I have dealt with over the years, and I've dealt with hundreds, essentially don't place any emphasis at all on instructional design of the courses that they approve. And that can be very deadly. That can be detrimental to a professional education regimen. So essentially, when hopefully your rules or regulations have at least some instructional design and delivery component, quality bar that has to be met. If not, IACET can help with that. That's what we do, is instructional design and delivery. We'll get to the delivery component in just a moment. Also, we see instructional design does not provide accountability for learning. That's another huge issue in instructional design. In other words, what do we mean by accountability? Well, accountability would be to ensure that the student has learned something by by requiring that they do something that shows a competency or that it shows that they've met the objectives of the course. So oftentimes providers get spooked by learners or large groups of learners that don't want to have to show any accountability for learning. Recently, I talked to two large education providers in a medical licensing that provides medical licensing content for a particular type of medical practice. And what they told me was amazing is that the people, the licensees in this particular medical profession, do not want quizzes or any type of exam to accompany their continuing education. They don't like to be held accountable. Now, certainly that's not the case with all professionals. Many professionals understand the need to be accountable and to provide some type of rigorous examination on a periodic basis. But for the most part, there are many professions that have a contingent that do not want, that they don't believe that it's necessary, nor that they do believe that they should have to prove themselves or have or prove any type of accountability for the learning that they undertake. That can be problematic, and it's something in the philosophy of how a regulatory agency operates that needs to be addressed by its leadership. So this is prevalent again in limited, if any, assessment that does not measure the outcomes. I've been told many times by many providers, oh sure, we offer assessment. We have 10 quiz questions at the end of a unit of instruction. Well, why 10? That really isn't impressive in and of itself. It would be impressive if you said you had 5 objectives and you had 10 quiz questions to effectively measure whether or not those objectives had been met. So really, it's not the number of quiz questions, it's whether or not those quiz questions are used to assess learning. Finally, we see this very prevalently. Instructional strategies are mismatched to the experience level of the practitioner. Or in other words, exercises are usually too easy or do not challenge the learner, and we see this a lot. So what this essentially means is, again, if the goal of a provider is to choose or to sell as much education as they can, it's going to be very tempting for them to sell compliance. And to sell compliance, they make it very easy for a practitioner to complete the education so they can do so in a minimal amount of time and opportunity cost. So what we see is, for example, when you have, if you're familiar, say, with Bloom's taxonomy, oftentimes you will see people who enter a profession taking basic level courses to acquaint them with the basics of a profession. We might call that qualifying education or pre-license courses. Then what providers like to do is take that same exact content and chop it up into segments, and then to re-offer the segments as continuing education. The problem is that a person who's been practicing for a number of years in a profession really doesn't need the basic content again. Now, sometimes they do. We're certainly not advocating for not reviewing or reinforcing certain things, but there's a fine line there between reviewing and then giving a learner something that's far too easy for where they are professionally, and it does not challenge them. So here we see, so if you're familiar with Bloom's taxonomy, we would often say this to paint with a broad brush. If you are teaching a qualifying education course, we would see maybe the first several levels of Bloom's addressed. Knowledge, comprehension, asking students basic questions, definitions, asking them to recognize. Those are all essentially relatively low level activities that would challenge a new learner for new content, a person who's developing their knowledge in an industry. But when a person's been practicing for years, you don't want to ask them a very basic question that you know is so fundamental that it doesn't really do them a lot of good to repeat that type of activity. They should have progressed by then. They should be up on Bloom's taxonomy. Instead of being asked to define something, they should be asked to evaluate. They should be asked to synthesize. They should be asked to compare and contrast. They should be able to have a better articulation of higher level learning the longer they've been in an industry. So keep in mind that it's not always best practice to rehash basic level courses for continuing education because it mismatches the content to a person's practical experience. So that's something that regulators can think about, and it's something often is very difficult to address. Finally, the third component that that a regulatory agency has to look at, or at least consider, is the delivery of the course. And let's take a few look at a few pitfalls of um, the delivery of courses. Delivery that allows for circumventing learning, especially in distance learning environments. So that's number one. When you deliver a distance learning course, can you just click through it? If it's supposed to take you 3 hours, can you finish it in 10 minutes? Is that acceptable? What if you can pass an exam? Well, how difficult was the exam? Some regulators say, well, as long as they can pass the exam, we don't care. Well, the problem is how difficult is the exam? Is it 2 questions? Is it 5 questions? Is it 20 questions? Is it 50 questions? And do those questions adequately measure the competency or the objectives that were set forth in the course? Delivery does not include course evaluation, nor does the provider show a commitment to ongoing improvement. Essentially, providers they may administer an end-of-course evaluation, but essentially they don't do anything with it. We see that over and over at IACET because that's one of the requirements for IACET accreditation is that a provider show evidence that they are using their evaluations to support an ongoing environment of improvement. Educational facilities are substandard for learning. You would think that that would not be an issue, but in many cases, unfortunately, is, especially with providers who are subject matter experts but who have not dedicated themselves to the mission of education. Learner support processes are non-existent, ignored, or not maintained. We see this over and over as well, is where a provider says, yes, they'll monitor an email. You audit for student help, but you audit a course and you ask a question and you don't get any response. Or I know I've reviewed hundreds of distance learning courses, and I have seen discussion boards that the provider will say that are maintained, and you log in to find questions from students from 3 years ago that have never been answered. These are all things that are detrimental to the instructional process and need to be considered when approving professional education. These are again the delivery components of a learning event or course. Instructors are subject matter experts, but not trained in adult education. We see this over and over. Oftentimes, instructors that are subject matter experts think that they can just get up and tell everybody what they know, and that will be that, and that will be the education. And oftentimes, that is substandard. Good instructors obviously need to be subject matter experts, but they also need to have some training in adult education. In other words, how do you engage a student? What is Bloom's taxonomy? How do you ensure you met your objectives? What are some additional instructional strategies for engagement and making sure that your course isn't boring for students, that's something that's engaging and make it a true quality learning experience? All these things can be taught. Good teaching is an art and science, and certainly if instructors dedicate themselves to quality instructional design and delivery, they can make great strides in providing very, very high and quality education. Education providers are industry experts but do not have focus or experience in education, and that again goes along with what one of the previous items that we have there. And that again is something that IACET is focused on helping industry solve, which we'll tell you more about that in just a few minutes. So finally, how does IACET help with these things? How does the International Association for Continuing Education assist in helping a regulator evaluate or help them with these 3 major components of evaluating an educational course for professional education? Well, here is how we can assist. Number one, quality content allows regulators. IACET could help regulators maintain focus on their true area of expertise, which is ensuring appropriate content. That is the regulator's primary mission, and oftentimes we see regulators get distracted by instructional design and delivery issues at the expense of ensuring quality content. On the instructional design and delivery side, this is where IACET excels. IACET's accreditation is all about ensuring quality instructional design and delivery. So Providers are accredited when a provider earns IACET accreditation. They're accredited against an ANSI IACET 2013 standard for continuing education and training. That standard has been approved or accredited by the American National Standards Institute, and IACET is an accredited standard developer by the American National Standards Institute. Providers who are accredited by IACET providers are accredited based upon their fulfillment and maintenance of the standard for instructional design and delivery. IACET also audits providers to ensure the integrity of accreditation. So essentially, our standard is based upon 10 different categories for instructional design and delivery. And we have numerous elements that go underneath each of those categories to help document that the provider is indeed prepared and capable of offering a quality learning experience. And finally, IACET works closely with regulatory agencies to ensure the integrity of the education offered in respective industries and professions at no cost to the regulatory agency. So in other words, the IACET standard, we accredit providers, and we work with the regulatory agencies in certain industries to ensure that that education is being offered in conjunction and in line with and in compliance with the IACET standard. If there's a problem with instructional design and delivery, IACET can address that, in contrast to having the regulatory agency address that. There's numerous ways that IACET can work with regulatory agencies, and we can discuss that here on the next slide in just a moment. But just keep in mind for now, IACET essentially, in many cases, handles the instructional design and delivery review, while the regulators can focus on their true area of expertise, which is content. So here are some FAQs, and I'll elaborate on just a few of them very quickly. Does a regulatory agency have to require IACET accreditation? Well, the answer is no, and a regulatory agency does not have to do anything, obviously, with IACET. However, in some cases, regulatory agencies don't require it, but in other cases, they simply add it as an option that can be recommended but is not required. So, for example, in the state of Colorado, the Department of Child Care Education says that if you're going to offer professional education in their industry, you have to fulfill one of two requirements. Your organization has to be a degree-granting institution, college or university, or if it's private, needs to be accredited by IACET. Those are the two ways that you can offer that type of professional education in the state of Colorado. And I could repeat numerous other examples of how regulatory agencies use IACET. In this case, IACET could be just an option where a regulatory agency encourages a provider to earn that accreditation to ensure the credibility of instructional design and delivery. Does IACET audit courses? Yes, IACET works to ensure the integrity of the standard, and providers offering IACET CUs are subject to audit. How much does IACET cost? This is really where the rubber hits the road for many regulators, because money is obviously always an issue. And IACET has worked very, very hard to maintain some of the most economical fees that are associated with education accreditation in the world. So IACET accredits providers. We don't accredit individual courses. We accredit the providers. This alone saves thousands of dollars. In some cases, tens of thousands of dollars. So we hold the provider accountable, and then they can offer as many courses as they want because we're evaluating their instructional design and delivery system that we approve when they offer IACET CEUs or continuing education units. So keep in mind that IACET accredits providers, not individual courses. Therefore, fees are not based on how many courses are offered. IACET fees are the lowest of any reputable agency that I know of, and membership dues are annually $835 plus the cost of the accreditation review, which is about $3,000 every 5 years. These costs are general estimates, and they're provided here as a big picture big picture fact, so you can take these costs back you can see the precise fees on our website at IACET.org. If you need IACET to come speak to your board, we are available to do that. We're always available to help promote professional education and training. That's what we do, and it's a part of the commitment we've made to help you as a regulatory agency. And where can you find out more? Well, there's a free white paper on our website, and it is called A Regulatory Guide to Maintaining the Integrity of Continuing Education Programs. It goes into quite a bit of detail on how to do some of the things we've talked about today and some more of the interesting facets of it. We also have a Train the Trainer workshops. IACET Adult Learning Workshops provide subject matter experts with a fun, intensive 2-day course on best adult learning practices. So if you need to help your instructors, if you need for your instructors to have a great day of training on how to teach adults, this would be the workshop for your organization. The workshop's ideal for instructors who want to find out best practices and methods for engaging learners and making education fun and effective. We've just kicked this off. We did one of our presentations in Lima, Peru. That's where you see the photos from here, and we had a great turnout there in Lima, and we've got several other we've done across the country and several across the globe that we'll be doing this next year. So for right now, I think that provides you a good overview of the IACET process and how to ensure the integrity of professional education. If there's anything that you'd like to contact me about, here's our contact information, and thank you for watching.